As a somewhat accidental pundit in this space, I'm really thankful to Bishop Stephen and Dr Bruce for the invitation to address you today. I also want to add my acknowledgement of to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past, present and emerging. I've entitled this section of the plenary, Spiritual Care in a Secular Age, Its Risks and Rewards, because I hope to perhaps integrate some of the themes we've been hearing from the perspective of theology and ethics. I'll first say something about some of the notions of risk around spiritual care that seem to dominate our friends and our neighbours' thoughts and fears. When it comes to the rewards offered by spiritual care, I want to look at more than mere benefits, as if the decision or not whether to offer spiritual care comes down to some calculation of risk versus benefit. Rather, I'll borrow from someone 1800 years distant to say a little on what makes it elemental to human flourishing in older age. Just for fun, I looked up spirit in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's all right, you don't have to read that. There's 4 more pages like that in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the word spiritual likewise. And the meanings of these words have been up for grabs for many centuries now. That's the take-home message from that. But modern Australia is going through a major reappraisal of how we understand spirit. And I thought I'd try a rough taxonomy of 4 approaches to spirit that are pretty common among us. And I know I've missed some views in this table, but we're trying to picture that range of people potentially entering our aged care settings. At one end of a notional spectrum are those whom we might regard as philosophically naturalist or materialist. In a kind of hard materialism, human life is only a system of cause and effect, so that concepts such as spiritual and even consciousness and love for some such people are only illusory byproducts of natural selection. But more common perhaps is a softer kind of naturalist who admits of no supranaturalist entity such as God, but who would concede a spirituality consisting in awe and wonder at the fact of existence, at beauty in its various forms and at relationships of love. The other end, perhaps, are those for whom spirit is supranatural, who think the universe to be upheld by a personal God or gods, who is fundamentally not of this natural order and so is spirit, yet who invites a relationship of love with mortal flesh, enabling us to become spiritual beings. And between those positions, I guess there are a whole plethora of takes on the spiritual where we may participate by various means with something supernatural, yet not exactly personal, and somehow interpenetrating everything around us. That merely gestures, I suppose, at the possible range of people we might meet. It's instructive, isn't it, to pan our mental cameras back to the Australia of several decades ago, where a mainly Christian clergyman, and it was usually a man or a deaconess, would rove the paths and corridors of an aged care facility, plying his or her spiritual wares, presuming that people of their own denominational kind looked forward to seeing him or her and chancing it that others might too. Sometimes they'd bring in a posse of volunteers, maybe kids from the youth group, or from a church's volunteer pastoral care team, to do their untrained best to connect with older people. This kind of arrangement was probably based on informal arrangements between management and the clerics, all brokered by the registered nurse or matron overseeing the place. It was premised on that informally privileged position that Christianity occupied in our cultural space. Its efficacy largely pivoted upon the character, wit and wisdom of the cleric concerned. There may be some settings left in Australia where those kinds of arrangements remain, but in most settings that's practically unthinkable. We've all, I guess, given some thought to the cultural trajectories that brought about the change, and here are just some. The logic of individual rights and informed consent, perhaps the cornerstone of any Western liberal democracy, has inexorably been applied to every corner of our lives together. It follows that no one may presume to access an older person in circumstances where that person has limitations on their mobility or cognition or power of expression. In a more amplified form, that logic becomes expressed in the language of consumer choice, where priorities in care must attend to the preferences of the cared for and monetise to sustain various business models of consumer-driven care, although whether that's actually happening in practice, we're we've heard this morning is debatable. Amplified in another direction, that logic entails a proactive awareness of diversity and a concerted check on majoritarian assumptions of the older Christian-dominated provision of spiritual care. The hard-edged expression of that impulse becomes the forbidding at a policy level of any form of discourse that could be regarded as proselytising, particularly in relation to people who cannot escape due to the limitations on their mobility, cognition or power of expression. Unfortunate experiences with particular clergy who some have found insensitive or inept or agenda-driven around the priorities of their own beliefs have been met, as is usually the case in modern Australia, with the imposition of this or that policy to deal with it generically rather than personally. So the qualification threshold for entry into this or that setting is shifted, and spiritual carers are only given access to those who ask for representatives from their own tribe, and so on. And an increasingly risk-averse culture in aged care settings necessitated, frankly, by precisely those egregious failures we've heard of this morning in the sector, further heightens the proper need to avoid distress, including the distress of various relatives. Risk mitigation around poor spiritual care by radically limiting it came to seem like a low-hanging fruit for beleaguered management. In each setting, some kaleidoscope of these has converged, and I mean no polemic in listing them. They broadly represent what is seen to be at risk if spiritual care is allowed to proceed, boiling down, I suppose, to the worry that someone may be exploited by it or distressed by it. And washing across these factors is that low-grade, militant secularist ideology that is hard to prove but easy to feel. All it takes is for one motivated person in this or that middle management position to have effective right of veto over spiritual care, leveraging these perceived risks to heighten fears around it. If the veto is not direct, it will take the form of that thicket of consent forms, scheduling conflicts, risk assessments, insurance compliances that present spiritual care as something dangerous and suspect. And in some settings, all of these combined create that chilling effect on all talk of the spiritual that really is a hallmark of modern Australian life. The registered nurse who visibly stiffens when a clergy person hoves into view, or the nursing assistant who moves just that little bit more quickly to finish and get out when someone in their care has a wave of sadness about their illness or their past life or their impending death. The family member in their parents' room who is visibly hostile when a volunteer pastoral carer knocks on the door. I was really interested to hear this yesterday actually with Sally Mordyke's presentation of the research that Liz spoke of this morning. Liz didn't mention this, but Sally said that a lot of the participants said that they were just overjoyed. This was the first such conversation they'd had about spirituality in some cases up to 8 years. It elegantly bespeaks the chilling that's evident in this matter. Now, I'm not about to plead for some kind of return to the good old days of Christian privilege, nor launch an attack on those trends. There have been very necessary protections upon the older people in our care. Indeed, the previous regime that arose organically out of Christendom had several unexamined assumptions and presumptions that drove the reactions to it. But when that chilling effect goes too far, older people are simply deprived of access to spiritual care in all its proper legitimacy. In the same way that flourishing life in older age might include new experiences or new uses of my body or new skills in this or that area of my life, so also it can include access to new spiritual approaches, including reappraisals of existing ideas that might not have served me so well. This chilling effect, and I think Ilse has touched on this, arises from staff underskilled in spirituality and from management sometimes projecting the baggage of their own life experiences, like we heard from Liz this morning about the Ethics Committee's projection of their own fears in evaluating her proposal. And despite that these staff do so well in caring on other fronts, it's still the case that the chilling effects may in the worst cases straightforwardly constitute abuse and neglect for people whose felt need is, more highly than any other, that desperation to assuage regret or find new meaning or understand their past and present and future, or to find a way to hope. At these points, access to actual, substantive, thick spiritual thought and practice may be as crucial as proper pain medication. Fears of proselytising at this point are as overstated as would be the case if we invoked the spectre of over-medication every time we offered pain relief. Several presenters at this conference have noted what becomes obvious in an aged care setting, that spirituality is somehow integral to who we are. And to fill that intuition out a little, I'd like to visit the 2nd century theologian Irenaeus of Lyon, one of Christianity's third generation, within kind of spitting distance of Jesus Christ. No one really knows what Irenaeus looks like, but when you Google all the weird old images of him in religious art, they all bear uncanny resemblance to this one. Irenaeus saw a biblical text like this one: "May the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit and soul and body be kept sound and blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." And even before you get to the Christian distinctives around God's gift of sanctifying people, Irenaeus noticed this ancient conception that we are not only a body, that we're not only a soul, and which, by the way, they took in a kind of semi-scientific way to describe that breath or spark of life that brings life and animation to our bodies, that we also consist of spirit, that part of us that answers to and resonates with God's own spirit to make us fully human. You see, in Irenaeus' understanding, you and I are beings who are made with God's imprint and with some life breathed into us. That's his understanding of soul, that initial breath of life. But our growth into life consists in having God's own spirit or self come into us, even as we approach and pass through death, in a manner that is patterned for all humanity by Jesus Christ. So even in suffering and bodily decline, the approach to us of the Spirit of God is inexorable. And the road into ageing is a road into further growth. To fight and resist that is like trying to fight puberty or middle age. Its onset tugs upon us as certainly as the pull of gravity. And so Irenaeus' account makes sense of why older people are so often hungry for spiritual reminiscence, reassessment and realignment. And conversely, I think it is no accident that the people who often gatekeep around the so-called risks of spiritual care are precisely at life stages characterised by the ego at its height, those least likely to be aware of the call of the Spirit that comes upon older people. I was part of a project headed by Bruce that surveyed the felt spiritual needs of 270 working and retired Salvation Army officers. They're ordained ministers in the parlance of other Christian denominations. Obviously, this group is quite specific, and no one claims that they represent the wider community. Indeed, the survey was motivated to improve and offer spiritual care appropriate for these people in the Salvation Army care settings that they are likely to enter. I've listed here the main papers that came out of this research. I was only involved in the part of it that tested their attitudes to ethically fraught end-of-life decisions. But suffice to say, in very brief summary, that this constituency were overwhelmingly interested to receive spiritual care in settings that were alert to their spiritual care needs. Far from having had a gutful of it as ministers, perhaps it was exactly that professional skill set that gave them the language, the awareness, and the cultural licence to be very clear and intentional about their expectation of spiritual care, that not only their soul and body be kept sound, as it were, but also their spirit. When that text I mentioned also adds spirit and soul and body being kept sound and blameless, it is usual for us to hear that word blameless in some kind of twee or pious or moralistic sense. But for Irenaeus, part of the growth in spirit that comes upon us all is the willingness to slough off habits and strategies that haven't worked for us nor with others, which in an older language was really all they meant by repentance. I'm reminded of this kind of sharpish comment by a chap called Roland Blythe, where he says, perhaps with full span lives the norm, people may have to learn how to be aged as they once had to learn how to be an adult. It may soon be necessary and legitimate to criticise the long years of vapidity in which a healthy elderly person does little more than eat and play bingo, or who consumes excessive amounts of drugs, or expects self-indulgent stupidity to go unchecked. Age does not exempt them from becoming despicable. Now, I quote this sharpish comment because of what the US theologian William May then goes on to say about it. May thinks that our reluctance to question the moral foibles of the old may subtly remove them from the human race. It pretends, in effect, that they are moral non-entities. It treats them condescendingly as though they were toys. We will take an important step toward re-entry into community with the age when we are willing to attend to them seriously enough as moral beings to approve and reprove their behaviour. Australians are so highly sensitised around being judged or being told what to do, even to being questioned, that I don't know what you'll make of these claims. Inevitably, they'll be misheard as a kind of stern moralism or some kind of call to disciplining people into various norms. But if I can persuade you not to arc up around that, simply weigh the possibility that good spiritual care includes some access to a forum in which to seek and find blamelessness, which doesn't mean perfection, but simply to be in a right standing with others, hence this paraphrase. As I listen to ideas that are floating around this conference, creating non-intrusive cultures of spiritual care can be straightforward, can't it? A regular conversation corner about people's spiritual journey, and perhaps including those practices of spiritual reminiscence. The focused use of spiritual care needs inventory every 6 months to each person in care, as mentioned in the video. The weekly Bible study, the multi-sensory worship service that we heard about in one of the concurrent presentations yesterday. Seminars in Christian contemplative practice, or some equivalent for the naturalists. Memoranda of agreement with spiritual carers that expect and performance manage around collaboration, skills at engaging with distress, and competence in offering meaning and hope. Opportunities for staff to explore issues and fears and spiritual underskilling, maybe even a kind of an existential kiosk where you can anonymously drop off your questions in a box for some simple and skilled answers. If that task of making a culture seems too big for you, then in addition to listening again to John Swinton's wonderful keynote yesterday, I too heartily commend these spiritual care guidelines that Ilse's introduced, particularly that section on the domains of care. Meaningful Ageing Australia and St Mark's National Theological Centre share a convivial corner. Around the corner in the back, if you haven't got a pen from me yet, you've got to come and get one. And I'm going to tell you more about our postgraduate course that enables you to become a thought leader in changing your setting towards a non-intrusive culture of spiritual care. The very same Elizabeth Pringle, who led the spiritual care guidelines, is the course coordinator of our graduate diploma and masters of ageing and pastoral studies. Why do this course? Well, because if Irenaeus is to be believed, it's not just that there are some rewards to spiritual care, it's that total care needs spiritual care, because to be human is to be inherently spiritual, and no cultural trends, no amount of chilling or gatekeeping will ever succeed to eradicate that. Thanks.